thank you guys so much for attending. How was the tour? Good. Brandon's not here, but I know Brandon does an amazing job. Again, thank you guys so much for being here. This is exciting. Hopefully this is the beginning of many more great things to come. We are excited here. We have a collection of esteemed historians, authors, and people that have contributed an immense amount to the Billy the Kid and the whole greater historical area that we love so much. So before we get going on the Q&A and the whole introducing everybody, I'm going to give the floor to the one and only Donna Tatting. She has probably one of the most valuable pieces of this Billy the Kid history that's incredibly hard to get hold of. And I know her family's put a tremendous amount of work into this project, so I'm going to give her the floor and allow her to share what she has with you guys.
Thank you.
Donna, please.
The 2-volume set is in the back of the room, if you actually want to see what it looks like. Here?
Yeah, come on over front.
But then you get to see all of me, right? Okay. All right, I wrote out a little thing a long time ago. Somebody asked me to do a podcast, and I agreed to do it, and then they called me back and said, no, they didn't want it anyway. So I have a chance to use it. I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1951, one of 3 children, a middle child, and I've lived in Minnesota my whole life. My parents divorced when I was just a little toddler, and my father moved to El Paso, Texas, married and had more children. That's Bob Barron. We reunited when I was 31 years old. I called my mom and said, do you mind if I get on a plane and go see my dad? She was fine with it. So I reunited with my dad at 31 years old on a trip I took to El Paso. And from that very first day when he picked me up at the airport, all he talked about was Billy the Kid, who I didn't, heard of him, but didn't know nothing about him. So the very next day, he put me and my little 2-year-old daughter in the car, and up we went to Lincoln. And on that particular day, they were having an auction at one of the buildings. They were selling all of the contents of one of the museum buildings. So early on, he kept talking about this Dudley Court of Inquiry thing that just sort of, glazed over. I didn't know until months later that he had purchased a copy of the microfilm from the Library of Congress on the Dudley Court of Inquiry, which is the only place it existed, was in Washington at the National Archives. And that entire document was handwritten in cursive by several different court reporters, so you don't even get the same penmanship. My dad purchased a microfiche machine and had the box full of microfilm, and he decided to let's roll that microfiche and see what's on there. He strained his eyes so bad that later on he ended up having to have surgery on one of his retinas. So a copy of those deciphered pages are in the Dudley Court of Inquiry 2-volume set, which is in the back. He tried to get a publisher all over the place, especially with university presses, but he just wasn't willing to lose so much profit on the book, which, by the way, I'll tell you now, he never made any money on the book, nothing. So he took it on himself. He spiral bound it, printed it on one side of paper, and made it into a 4-volume set, which he sold for $75. And he was a member of the Billy the Kid Outlaw Gang, so that was where most of the sales went then. Actually, his involvement in the historical research community, sales of the document were going pretty well within that community, but that was short-lived because he developed cancer, became very, very sick, needed chemo treatments, and eventually died in March of 1998. So my husband and I traveled back to El Paso sometime later to help clean out this huge amount of research material that he had. And amongst all that stuff was the original typewritten sheets of the Dudley Court of Inquiry. None of my half-siblings or his wife didn't want anything to do with any of it. My dad's wife was ill with cancer at the time. So with her blessing, she said, take whatever you want. And I did. So over the years, I've spent hours and hours going through boxes and boxes of material. It was overwhelming. A few years ago, I made the decision to pass some of what I had brought home with me to another person who I knew would appreciate it and do something with it. So here's where the work began. My dad printed the 4-volume sets individually as they were sold, so I had no set of my own at all. But amongst his research, I found the printed sheets. They were all attached to each other. Remember that when Xerox paper came that way? That he used to make copies from, then bind the books to create a set. I spent about 5 hours at a copy machine at my brother-in-law's office making more copies just in case anything happened to the original ones. Because if something happened, that would be it. So a couple of years later, I was cruising the website for the Billy the Kid Outlaw Gang, and one of the members had posted something on their site, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. She was selling her Dudley Court of Inquiry, the original one. So I immediately contacted her, paid $100 for it, and I finally had it. I finally had the book. And the result was, and then I took it to a publisher, and the result was the original softcover set that was published in 2003 and cost about $90. But even before I went to the publisher, I went to this organization that's, I don't think is really very active anymore, the Billy the Kid Outlaw Gang, to get their response. What do you think? Is this going to be worth it? And then after I went there, I reached out to Fred Nolan and Leon Metz. They were both very good friends of my dad's. I hit the jackpot. They were all in. Do it, do it, do it as fast as you can. So Leon wrote the introduction to the Dudley Court of Inquiry, and Fred sent me a packet of all of his own personal copies of significant photos that he thought would work well in the book. I was overwhelmed with the support that I got from both of them. The first sets were printed as a softcover in 2003, and a second set was printed, second set of 25, was printed in 2018, and they all sold at the Wild West History Association up in Ruidoso, right? So I never used a publishing company to publish the book. I've done it all myself. Instead, I do the sales right from home. Part of the reason is I'm really interested in who's buying it. It's not like it's a bestseller on the bestseller list, you know? So let's face it, the first version's now at $250, which for anyone here who wants to buy the set, it's $200, plus there's a couple of freebies there for you. So each person who has gotten the book, I've gotten some really great little notes and emails about how appreciative they are that this book even exists. So the newest edition wasn't exactly my idea, it was this guy's idea, Roy Young. He suggested I publish it, but pretty it up a little bit, you know, make it kind of interesting, make it a hardcover, make it an illustrated slipcase, make it a collector's item. So I immediately thought that was a fantastic idea, and I went to work doing just that. I went back and cleaned up a couple mistakes. There were about 7 repeated pages. And a friend of mine who's a printing broker took charge of finding me a printer and negotiating an order. So due to COVID-related material, it took longer than I wanted it to. It took a few months longer, like I said, and the book is beautiful. It's definitely a showpiece for any home library on Old West history. In 1982, when my dad, one of the premier Lincoln County war historians, dragged me to Lincoln, along with my very unhappy 2-year-old daughter, to walk the famous streets where so much history was made, I just never thought, that I would be imprinted with the life of Billy the Kid in Lincoln, New Mexico. It's been a long journey, and I've been back to Lincoln more times than I can count. But the only visit I really regret was the one my dad first took me on, because I couldn't begin to realize how deep this passion was, how important this history was. It was just kind of went whooshing over my head. But eventually, the seed was planted, and though it started out as just a little plant, it grew into a big tree of knowledge that I could never have envisioned on that first visit. Though excerpts from over 1,000 pages of the Dudley Court of Inquiry can be found in almost every book written about the Lincoln County War and Dudley's despicable actions in it. This 2-volume set is as complete as it gets. During his career, Dudley certainly had some shining moments. I did some studies on his career, and in fact, he did have some shining moments. And I don't want to erase or disparage those parts of his military career that are commendable. However, throughout his career, there were issues, and his partisanship, his behavior, and his actions in that famous 3-day battle made things much more deadly than they already were. Much of the testimony is compelling, primarily because it comes right from the mouths of people like Susan McSween and Billy the Kid. It's not hearsay, but their very own words, officially recorded. And those words are spoken often with determination to see justice, specifically to end the court-martial, in the court-martial of Colonel Dudley. And just a little tidbit, and I just found this out last year. I've lived in Minnesota all my life, and I've always been interested in Minnesota history. While doing some sideline research on Dudley, I discovered that he served for a time right in St. Paul, Minnesota at Fort Snelling. And that was at the time of the Sioux Uprising of 1862. I pass by the old fort several times a month because several times a month I go to the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport and I volunteer with the Armed Forces Service Center Traveling Military. So little did I know that there was a part of Dudley's history right there outside my car window in Minnesota, and I had no clue. And it just seems like something indeed was meant to be. So the one thing I wanted to add to this, my dad was a coffee drinker and a smoker. I can't believe he lived as long as he did. Every single page looked like this. Spilling the coffee all over. I mean, I have dozens of pages like this. And this picture here, I treasure it. This is Leon Metz. I'll show you guys later. Leon Metz, my dad, Bob Barron, Bob Bose Bell, who most of you know, and Jim Browning. Those were the big guys. Those were the guys. So thank you very much for being here. If you're interested in purchasing a collection, they're back in the back table. They're a little gift I'm also giving away for free. So thanks again for listening and being here.
For each of our guests here that we think will really highlight some of their knowledge and information. And then at the end, we'll open it up to questions and you guys can ask and pick the brains of some of the brightest minds we have. So we'll proceed. And forgive me, I'm going to give a brief introduction, but it's only as accurate as the internet. So if I say something that grossly misrepresents your expertise, just blame it on the internet. All right, in no particular order, we have Mr. Roy Young, sitting dead center right there. Roy is a charter member of the Wild West History Association, where he was the first vice president and editor of both the Journal and the Sandbag newsletter. He's authored numerous books and articles on outlaws, lawmen, and frontier scouts. His honors include the 2013 Six-Shooter Award for lifetime contributions to Wild West history. His book, A Wyatt Earp Anthology, Long May's Story Been Told, was named 2019 Book of the Year by True West and WWHA. He operates Young & Son Enterprises, an Old West book roundup, specializing in the rare and collectible books. Mr. Roy Young. Certainly not in order of importance, we have the one and only Miss Lynda Sanchez. Miss Lynda has been a lifelong educator, historian, Lincoln native, local I should say, a Lincoln County local resident, and author of one of my most favorite books on the incredibly historic site that is Fort Stanton. She authored probably my favorite book.
I didn't know that.
It is, and I love it. And I've worn the pages off of the cover. So, Miss Lynda Sanchez. And to the right we have David Thomas. He's author, historian, filmmaker, producer, actor, screenwriter, travel writer. I think I got all of them.
No, he's a really good friend too.
And a good guy all around. Co-founder of Pat Garrett Western Heritage Festival, co-founder of the Friends of Pat Garrett. He has authored a wealth of knowledge, and probably my single most favorite book on Billy the Kid's grave, Mr. David Thomas. I saved the best for last. No pressure, John. We have John LeMay of Roswell. He's the author of 25 plus books on Southwest history, cryptozoology, UFOology, and film. His works include Tales, and Half-Truths of Billy the Kid, Jaws Unmade, the Real Cowboys and Aliens series with No Torres. He also created the Cowboys and Saurians series.
Yeah. Cowboys and Dinosaurs, yeah.
Cowboys and Dinosaurs?
Yeah.
Okay. Cowboys and Dinosaurs. Exploring Old West dinosaur and cryptid lore.
I think I would have preferred if you just cherry-picked the Billy the Kid stuff.
No. I went for the weird and obscure. Past president of the Historical Society for Southeastern New Mexico, writes a regular column for Vision Magazine, contributes to Cinema Retro, GFan, Mad Scientist, and many more things. The often talented and widely varied John LeMay. All right, I picked these in random order, so please don't be offended. First question is for Mr. Young. Your last book, Chasing Billy the Kid, finally gives the much needed attention to Frank Stewart and his role in the capture of Billy the Kid. Tell us about that, and why do you think only Garrett's stories were told?
Well, my writing partner, Kurt House, bought this gun, and it was engraved to Frank Stewart. And Kurt asked me to do research and find out who this guy was, because his name rarely appeared in any book having to deal with Billy the Kid. So I gave him an 8-page report, and at the end I said, this guy needs a book. Well, 5 years later, it became this book, Chasing Billy the Kid. Frank Stewart was given short shrift by Jim East and Charlie Siringo and others. I don't know that Frank was a real personable guy, but they told a lot of stories on Frank that were just not true. And fortunately, we now have such great internet capabilities of researching contemporary newspapers. The Las Vegas Optic and the Las Vegas Gazette especially held Frank Stewart in high regard, and in many of their articles they listed him first and Pat Garrett second. Well, because Ash Upson and Pat Garrett put out that book that kept the story of Billy the Kid going, and self-aggrandizement crept in, as it often does in old-timers' stories. Pat gave minimal coverage to Frank Stewart, and so as a result, it took a lot of effort in going into original documentation to prove that Frank Stewart was a co-leader, equal leader of Pat Garrett and the posse. However, Frank Stewart didn't kill Billy the Kid. And as a result, Pat Garrett's story, Pat Garrett's name, became connected with the Billy the Kid story long before Utley and Metz and Gardner and Wallace and Utley and all of us started writing books. And Frank Stewart was given a very minor role in most of those books. But when Kurt bought this gun, we learned that it was one of a pair. Well, where's the other one? And we searched for 2 years for the other one. And we were at Bill Koch's ranch in Colorado going through his gun collection. And my wife said, Roy, here's a gun that has Frank Stewart's name on it.
Wow.
And serendipity, Kurt and Bill and I are very close friends, and we had no idea that Bill Koch owned the other of this pair of pistols. And we were able to put them back together. The cylinders had been switched at some point in time. And it was just a great occasion to be able to put those two pistols back together. But if you're interested in the true story of the chase and capture of Billy the Kid that doesn't give all the aggrandizement to Pat Garrett, this is the book, and I hope you will consider giving it a read.
No, as far as I know, John has authored the only book that I've ever read on the life of Ash Upson. So if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic read. John, tell us a little bit about what made Ash so historically significant in the process you went into writing that book.
One thing I've learned is when you're writing one book, it will lead into another book. I had just done Tall Tales and Half Truths of Billy the Kid, and I came across all these really cool Pat Garrett stories that didn't fit that book. And when you work with a publisher, they give you a page limit that you can't, go beyond. So I thought, well, I'm going to save those for a Pat Garrett book, and I did that. Then I had to fill out the Pat Garrett book, and as I was researching Garrett, I kept coming across these really amusing stories about Ash Upson. And what got me was they were funny. They were stories about him getting drunk and disorderly and having these misunderstandings, and I just wanted to read a biography of Ash Upson, and I took it for granted that one already existed, because I thought, obviously you would write a biography of Ash Upson, he's so interesting. And I was really shocked when I learned nobody had ever done that. But as Roy has just said, it's easier for us today, actually, because we have so much access to newspapers and records. And in my case, I was able to just email the Haley Library and say, hey, I'd like this, and they, you pay a fee and they email it back to you and you're done. It's really effortless. So I just had a great time finding every bit of information I possibly could on Ash Upson, putting it in the book. I would say I do kind of like James Mills does. James Mills gets every single story. He doesn't necessarily say, this was true, this is what happened. He just says, this is what so-and-so said, and then you don't really always defend it. You just say, this is what this source said, and this is the story. And I just kind of put them all in chronological order. And the other thing about Ash was he wrote letters to his family back east all the time, and thank God they actually got preserved. And so I mainly let Ash tell his own story. I didn't see any point in me paraphrasing it. And I will say I got it accepted with a university press, and they wanted me to paraphrase most of the letters, and I didn't want to, and so I decided to just self-publish it. But it was with the publisher initially, and I thought people would just enjoy reading it in Ash's own terms, and so that's how it played out. And it's probably my most respectable book, because there's no aliens or anything like that.
Thank you. Great, cool collection of the history of Fort Stanton. There's incredible pictures in there that kind of shares that great visual representation of the history. Can you tell us a little bit about your research into Fort Stanton and maybe kind of tie that into the life of Billy the Kid?
Well, can I take a little detour for a public service announcement?
Please do.
Okay. Can you all hear in the back?
Yes, ma'am.
Because as an old school teacher, I really aim for those types. But anyway, we have some great news in terms of Fred Nolan. Most of you, all of you, I'm sure know who Fred Nolan is. Well, his papers are now in Las Cruces. They are available for researchers to come in at this point in time. It was a great coup for New Mexico, and I was thrilled to know that they came here instead of Oklahoma or someplace like that. So they're ready to go. Also, as a resident of Lincoln, and I guess the only resident of Lincoln, I wish to welcome all of you to my community. It's really great to see individuals who are so enthusiastic about our history. And it's really kind of an amazing place, and I'm sure that people like Josh and Amy and other groups will continue. I want to also congratulate you and thank you for having this seminar. So that's my detour. The Fort Stanton story was kind of like this story here of Frank Stewart. It had been a hospital for years and years, and it was never really put forward as a historic site. It was still being used as a hospital. Well, I finally started doing some research, and I thought Fort Stanton really needs a book that illustrates the entire history, 150, 200 years of history. And that's what I started doing. And of course, Billy, when he was here, he was actually thrown in jail at the fort. In fact, one of the buildings is still there, and you can see the bars where they put him. Another thing that Billy often did was he and his guys often harassed the mescaleros who were around Fort Staten. And I'll have a story to tell maybe in a little bit about Billy the Kid stealing an old mule, and it'll be sort of interrelated there. But the story of Fort Staten and Lincoln can't really be separated, because Fort Staten was built in 1855 and Lincoln was about 1848. So, you know, it kind of grew up with this community. And that, I mean, there's just so much to say. You have to get my book.
It's a must.
You've got a theory about why Billy the Kid picked the day that he did to escape from the courthouse.
That's true. And this has not been written about. It's not in your book, Roy. But remember, Billy the Kid had been promised a pardon. He was going to be pardoned. He was present when Chapman was killed. And Dudley, in his reports to the federal government, which I'm not sure anyone else has ever seen, talks about the Chapman killing. And he, among others, say that Billy had sent a letter and they had agreed to meet in order to make peace. So Chapman is killed, as I mentioned earlier. 2 bullets, one from a rifle, one from a pistol. Dolan claims he had a rifle with him. Why would you be carrying a rifle? He said, I never shot him. I shot and missed him, but there were 2 bullet holes in him. Jesse finished him off by pouring alcohol on him and lighting him. But anyway, Billy, of course, was there. And the deal that Wallace offered him was, if you'll testify at the grand jury when they're investigating Chapman's death, then I will grant you an unconditional pardon for all past offenses. So it was a bit of a complicated thing. Billy tried to surrender several times, but eventually he surrenders. He's put in jail in Lincoln. He testifies at to the grand jury, just like he promised Wallace he would do. After that testimony, he hangs around for a couple of days, and then he says, in one of his letters, he said, I decided to scoot out of there. So he left, okay? Now, later on, when Wallace wrote about this particular pardon, and he wrote 2 articles about it, he said, I promised Billy a pardon if he testified and if Chapman was convicted. I mean, if the killers were convicted. Well, they were not. They were not convicted. Dolan was eventually indicted. He was tried after Billy was killed. Judge Bristol, who, as you know, was incredibly biased, basically stopped the trial before it even proceeded with any testimony, and Dolan got off completely. So, you know, that's just one more example of how unbelievably biased the establishment, I guess you would say, the legal and economic establishment was against Billy, and there's example after example of that.
Thanks, Dave. Your favorite ghost story about Billy?
My favorite ghost story about Billy was the fact that he actually told ghost stories himself. That was what I found the most interesting. I mean, otherwise the ghost stories about Billy are about what you'd expect, that his shackles rattle throughout the Lincoln courthouse and stuff like that.
They do.
Yeah. But I love the fact that Billy himself told his own ghost stories, and it was in the book Los Belitos that the family recorded allegedly the ghost stories that Billy told. And what he essentially did was pick up Hispanic folk tales and repackage them to set them in Lincoln. And Billy told the typical story about the devil at the bale, about the girl who dances with the stranger who walks in and he develops the chicken feet. And Billy gave his own flourishes to that. So I would say my favorite story was just the fact that Billy told these stories themselves, and he relocated one to Lincoln. So I thought that was really neat.
Mr. Young, WWHA Journal. So undoubtedly you've read and authored your fair share of articles and interesting stories about Old West outlaws and characters. Tell me what it is about Billy the Kid that you think sets his story apart from the others that you've read.
When I was 12 years old, I found out that one of my ancestors had killed Morgan Earp, and 2 days later, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday killed him. My mother was a Stillwell, and this fellow's name was Frank Stillwell. So from age 12, I would be watching Tombstone Territory or The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp, and I fell in love with the entire Wild West. I later found out that I had 27 blood ancestors who were Texas Rangers. I never thought about Billy the Kid being a topic of interest for me, but when Kurt bought this gun and had asked me to do that report, I decided it's time, Roy, for you to get interested in the Lincoln County War and Billy the Kid. My book doesn't really cover a big part of the Lincoln County War because I was really interested in the role that Frank Stewart played in chasing Billy the Kid and what I call Billy and the Boys. We always try to figure out whether it's Billy's gang or what we're going to call them, but I call them Billy and the Boys. But I fell in love with Billy the Kid. When I was teaching history in high school, I would often ask one of my American history classes, how many of you know who Jesse James was? Well, one or two hands would go up. How many of you know who John Wesley Hardin was? No hands would go up. Doc Holliday, one or two. Wyatt Earp, one or two. But when I said, how many of you know who Billy the Kid was, every hand would go up. Around the world, Billy the Kid is the most famous American that ever lived. Well, I'm exaggerating.
That's true.
It's true. Maybe Abraham Lincoln comes in ahead of him. But Billy's life just thrills me, and I love every bit of it, from his birth to his death and everything that has happened after that. At the Wild West History Association annual meeting coming up in Albuquerque next July, 15th through 18th, we're going to have a number of programs on Billy the Kid, but I'll be directing a panel on the last days of Billy the Kid, and we're really going to examine what happened at the Maxwell house. And I just find that whole thing fascinating. I have no interest in John Miller, and I have no interest in Brushy Bill, but what really did happen, and so these are things that the Wild West History Association Roundup in Albuquerque will be looking at next July.
First time here in Lincoln, and you've called Lincoln home for quite some time now.
52 years.
Only 52 years. What's one thing you would want these folks to know about this community and its history?
About this community? Well, 50 years is a long time. And when I came here, I was a young widow, and there were many widows in this area, but I was the young widow, and I had a little girl. And so that is what eased me into the community, because the people were very welcoming, just like the Hispanic people were with Billy. You know, they kind of took him under their wing and took care of him and helped him and did things like that. So a welcoming community, and it still had many of the older folks who remembered their father's stories of Billy the Kid. So Billy the Kid was part of the atmosphere when I came here, and I didn't know very much about Billy the Kid other than, you know, the movie Billy the Kid. And as I progressed and found out that my neighbor, Jeronima Garcia, happened to be married to a man who lived here when Billy the Kid was here, I mean, that kind of shocked me, because, you know, oh, really? And she said, yes, and he played marbles with Billy the Kid. And I couldn't believe that, but then I thought Billy was a young man, and this gentleman was probably 18 or 19. And so those are little stories that you don't get in the history books. And I began to become more and more interested as I moved into being a teacher in the community. And if I have time later, I'll mention some of the relatives, like Captain Brady. You know, he has tons of relatives who live in the valley.
Mr. Thomas, as I said before, you authored one of my favorite books on Billy the Kid. It talks about Billy the Kid's grave. Tell us about your research into Billy the Kid's grave and the degree of certainty in which the location is.
Yeah, that's, I spent about 5 years on that, and that was my first book on Billy the Kid, and I loved the idea of researching the grave. I spent many weeks in Fort Sumner. The Fort Sumner paper at the time was only available, and still only available in the courthouse, never been microfilmed. And I found, the story turned out to be utterly amazing. It was unmarked for 42 years. At a certain point, Garrett and a writer visited, and the newspaper reported about it, and it took them a while. They found the site. For example, in the 30s, it turns out that Maxwell's had put the site into public property when he sold his property in Fort Sumner, but a guy bought the property, bought quite a bit of the property around there. In the 30s, he thought he had the cemetery. He plowed it. He was going to plant it. There were still, local community was still burying people in there. And so they organized a meeting. They posted the notice for the meeting on the side of Billy's stone. And by the way, in locating the grave, 1908, man was hired to remove the military burials. And he drew a map. And that map shows where Billy's grave is, where his two companions is. They're not in a line, they're off a little bit. But that matches within a foot or so where the marker of the grave now is. And the military burials that removed, the men, there were 21 of them, they were in perfect condition. So even though the cemetery was flooded for about 10 days, 4 or 5 feet deep, and you'll hear people tell you either the location is wrong or it's washed away or something, I'm able to demonstrate in my book that that's not happened, that they were not washed out because of those military graves were in good condition, as he says. But anyway, 4 men located the site. They eventually built a stone around it. There was a war that was held in the early 60s between Lincoln and Fort Sumner. A woman came into the area. She said, I'm a descendant of Billy. And based on her claim, Lincoln sued Fort Sumner, and it said, we want to move Billy's grave to Lincoln, and you're not taking care of it. And besides, the only thing you're doing with it is using it for tourist revenue. So it actually went to trial. And then, of course, as you know, the small stone, and have all the details of who made it, when it was given, was stolen for 21 years. And it was eventually found, there was a property sold in the Dallas area, and the new owner moved a train car that they had been storing things in, and they found that stone under there. So they returned it eventually. And then, of course, it was stolen again for 6 days by a trucker who came from California, a young man, 21 years old, and now he got over the fence, and how he stole it, because it's not light. But anyway, he had a party and invited all his friends over, and the word leaked out that he had Billy the Kid's stone. And so then it was brought back, but he was never charged. That's just one of the amazing stories connected with his marker.
It's a fascinating read. It's on John Chisholm, and even working on publishing a book on John Chisholm. Is that factual? Is it real true?
There's 2 different ones, yeah.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about John Chisholm and tell us what your plans are.
So John Chisholm is Roswell's main tie to the Billy the Kid myth. I always joke that the founder of Roswell, Captain Lee, supposedly laid down the law to Billy the Kid and said, don't shoot anybody here and this and that. And, obviously Billy the Kid never killed anyone in Roswell, and back then they thought it was great. I say it would have been great if he had killed someone in Roswell, because then we would have had something else to promote other than the aliens. But we do have John Chisholm. We have a great big bronze John Chisholm statue in downtown Roswell. If you're in the area, it's worth checking out, as well as the statue of Pat Garrett. But yeah, John Chisholm, just a fascinating figure. There's been several books on him. I am way too daunted to attempt a biography of John Chisholm because there's just too much. But I did recently do with the Historical Museum in Roswell. We have a lot of photographs. We did a pictorial history of John Chisholm's South Springs Ranch. including its later years when it was under the management of John James Hagerman. So that should be out in January. And then I just find the lives of the Chisholm Cowboys to be interesting. And I think myself and James Townsend are similar, and also Shane over there. We like to write up short biographies on sort of the unsung historical figures. And Chisholm had some really interesting cowboys under his employ, so I'm just planning on doing a book of little biographical sketches of those cowboys and their lives, and just interesting stories that nobody's ever really bothered to compile in one book before.
About Billy? What did you say?
Yeah, you had an interesting story about Billy.
Oh,
that
about
you wanted to
Billy
share?
and stealing an old mule
Yeah.
from a group of mescaleros. Now, that story is in this book, Apache Legends and Lore, because the Apaches did know who Billy the Kid was, and in fact, Eric Tortilla was in an interview with Eve Ball, and he told Eve that the Hispanic people, all of the ones that the mescaleros worked with, like for cowboying or the timber industry, that there were many tales, and the dominant tale was that Billy did not die. Now this was like 40 or 50 years after all of these events occurred. So Mr. Tortilla was telling her all of these things, and then another story that he came up with was how Billy the Kid stole a huge mule from one of the mescalero chiefs over at Fort Stanton. And it's quite a story because Billy and the Apaches really didn't care for each other. You know, it was just like the Anglos and the Apaches, and there was all this confrontation. And so the mescaleros at Fort Stanton began to build these huge brush corrals to protect their livestock from rustlers. Whereas, you know, normally we blame the Indians for stealing our stock, right? Well, this was the opposite way, and Billy and his group were kind of mischievous. They were young, they wanted to do stuff at night, and so they said, let's go steal some of those mescalero horses. And Billy said, and I want that mule. Now the mule at night was tied inside of the teepee. You could see the lead rope. This story was told by Apollonia Cedillo from San Patricio. And he said, Billy and I decided we were going to get the mule. And we had a problem. It was with dogs. They kept barking. And we couldn't sneak up on the mule to steal him. So what Billy said is, aha, I have some sopapillas in my saddlebags. Now, you all know what sopapillas are. They're fry bread. And so cowboys took those or biscuits and just as something to eat. And Billy went to the saddlebags, got a bunch of sopapillas, gave them to the dogs, went into the brush corral, cut the lead rope from the teepee, and rode out on that old mule. And it was, there were several other horses in the corral at the time, and they drove them up to Raton Springs, which was about 10 miles from here. You go up toward Capitan and up Salazar Canyon. There's a place called Raton Springs. They kept the horses there for a while, and then they supposedly drove them to the Chisholm Ranch and sold them and used them or whatever. But I thought that was a really unique story of Billy and his relationship with the Apaches.
Can you tell us the story?
Yes, I think. I've written quite a few books since I wrote this one, and I had to read it again to see what all I had to say. When Billy was captured, in some form or fashion, he presented his bay mare to Frank Stewart. And Frank kept it for a while, but then presented it to Scott Moore's wife as a gift. Scott and his wife left the hotel out at, help me with the name of the hotel.
Hot Springs.
Pardon?
Hot Springs?
No, the one out north of Las Vegas, Hot Springs. The Adobe Hotel. They sold the whole Adobe Hotel and it was soon torn down. All that story doesn't matter as regard to the horse, but he moved to Albuquerque where he purchased that biggest hotel that was there at the time. It's all in here. My mind just doesn't bring some of these things together. And they kept their a group of horses on a small ranch that they had, including Billy's horse. And Billy's horse was a mean horse. It bit some of the ranch hands. It knocked down one of the men who was trying to work with it in the pasture. And eventually, what I believe is an accurate picture of the horse appeared that we published in the Tombstone Epitaph. The funny thing is that later I found out that the horse of Billy's came with his saddle. And when Frank Stewart gave the horse to Scott Moore's wife, he kept the saddle. And his sons used that saddle for years in rodeos until it just eventually fell apart. I wish we knew where any part of that saddle is today. But I recently read where someone was saying, well, that's not Billy the Kid's horse in that picture. I firmly believe from my research that it is Billy's horse. And what happened to it after Scott and his wife divorced, I don't know. But the horse was eventually sold. Where it lived out its life is a mystery. But it's an interesting story how the horse went from Billy to Frank Stewart to Scott Moore's wife and then to whatever happened.
Lost to history.
Yeah.
About Billy's two betrayals. Will you tell us the story?
Well, that's interesting, yeah, because it's like a movie. Billy is betrayed at the beginning of his story. Brazel, who was Portuguese, who was born on an island in the Atlantic off of Portugal, was up here. He had a ranch. I know you found his location of his ranch and so on. And he betrayed Billy. He met with Garrett. He told Garrett where to find Billy in the rock house. Now this is, of course, in an extremely harsh winter. Snow is very deep. And then after Billy escaped from the Lincoln jail, the newspapers are saying, well, Garrett, why aren't you doing anything? And he didn't seem to be making any great effort to catch Billy. And as I discovered, he had a brand new daughter. It was only a little bit over a month old. Plus, at that point, he'd bought the Wortley Hotel, and he had received quite a bit of money for capturing Billy. And then he gets a letter from Brazel telling him that Billy is hanging out in the Fort Sumner area. And the day after he gets that letter is when he goes out, and he's eventually able to kill Billy. So at the beginning he's betrayed by Brazel. At the end he's betrayed by Brazel. So if Brazel had not existed, maybe Billy would never have been captured, and maybe he would never have been killed.
Cheating, you can't steal somebody else's answer. So I'm going to make David go last, so it's most challenging for him.
Oh, okay.
And I'll start with John because I think he needs the layup right now. Tell me, what do you think is the biggest misconception the public has about Billy the Kid?
I think they just still believe a lot of the folklore as opposed to the hard facts, and because for many years the saga of Billy the Kid was the best-selling kid book, and the same with Garrett's Authentic Life, which only about half of it was probably accurate. So I don't know which single, maybe the whole thing about killing 21 men, that's probably the one that really hangs around still.
Ms. Sanchez?
A lot of people still consider Billy an outlaw more than he perhaps was. When I came here, I considered him an outlaw, and a young outlaw. But as I got to know more about the people who knew him and the way history was, I realized he was such a young man at that time, and the misconception of his violent behavior, that's probably the biggest thing. And I think James Mills in his books has brought to life the real Billy more than perhaps any author of late. And to be considered so violent, and yet some of the stories of his kindness and his fun-loving ways kind of cross over. Another misconception right up there is that maybe Billy didn't die, and that's something that I found out when I came here, and there were a couple of stories that were told to me that sure sounded, pretty valid. And if we have time, I can mention them. They're still circulating among the people in the area.
Roy, what do you think the biggest misconception is?
That Billy was a juvenile delinquent. I do not believe that. Did he get in trouble? Yes. Did he do things he shouldn't have done? Yes. But we have to look at his years of growing up and the loss of his own father at an early age, the tragic death of his mother, and the meanness of his stepfather. But when you get into people who knew Billy, and I've studied over 100 people who knew Billy, he was so well liked. He was loved. He was a Christian man. You're going to say, what? Read the Ely book about Billy leading singing at church right here in Lincoln. He went to Sunday school. He went to church while he was here in Lincoln. Ash Upson would tell stories about him helping a kid cross a puddle or carrying groceries for a lady. Jan Donahue over here has a story of her father, her husband's father, grandfather, Rufus Donahue, how Billy helped him to cross a herd of cattle across a stream that was swollen, and they had to swim across the stream to get this accomplished. Billy was a good guy who met some sad circumstances, and I don't hold him up for what he did to James Bell or anyone else shooting people down in cold blood. I'm not trying to honor him at all. I once spoke to the Aspen Institute up in Colorado, and they were all talking about how we glorify these outlaws. It's a part of our history. The outlaw era is a part of our history. Billy was a victim of circumstances in some cases. He made his own trouble at times, but I'd like to have known the guy. He just seems to me like a guy I'd like to have known, in spite of his proclivities for mischief. But that, to me, is the major thing that people don't understand about Billy, that everybody loved Billy.
Well, and also, Roy, the fact that my neighbor said he played marbles with the kids in town behind the Montano store. Marbles was a very popular game at that time, and it just shows again the good guy, the good aspect of this young man.
David, I know you probably knew the answer before everybody else, but they've really covered all the great things. But what else can you add?
Well, they haven't covered one of my favorite theories.
I knew you'd have something.
I don't think that Billy in the last year, maybe year and a half of his life after he left Lincoln because the Lincoln County War and went to Fort Sumner, was wrestling cattle at all. The newspapers in 1877, they're reporting on a wrestling ring called The Boys. And the only person ever written about it is Nolan, and he hasn't written very much. But the papers are full of it. It's led by Jesse Evans, and they're doing extensive wrestling, okay? And then when Billy turns himself in to testify in the grand jury about Chapman, he's interrogated by Governor Wallace. And Wallace debriefs him, and those notes exist. And he tells how the boys were stealing cattle and how they were smuggling to Las Cruces and they're smuggling the kidney and selling them and so on, and he gives the routes, and he gives a pretty detailed analysis, and this is this is The Boys, which started about 1877. Now, Wild, which you know got the wonderful book of, as it says that Billy and Rudabaugh and Wilson robbed the stage as it was leaving Fort Sumner. And everybody that's ever written about Billy the Kid says, yes, that's true. Well, of course, when I was researching my book on Rudabaugh confesses, and that was him and Wilson and Pickett, and Billy was not involved. So you say, shouldn't be called an outlaw. He never ever robbed anybody. He never stole anything. The only incident that you can possibly point to is the stage robbery, which Rudabaugh says he was not there, and they stole almost $30, okay? And initially, the driver of the stage was accused, he was arrested, they thought it was a put-up job. There was a female passenger. Later on, of course, they sorted it out, and when Wilson was captured with Billy, he had the $20 bill that was stolen in that robbery. So, Billy was totally penniless. He had no money. If he'd been wrestling horses, if he'd been wrestling cattle, if he'd been doing all these things, he would not have been totally penniless. He was absolutely penniless. So was Wilson, so was Rudabaugh. Rustling cattle makes you money. There is no, other than just these accusations, there's no evidence that he was rustling cattle in the last year or year and a half of his life. As he said in the letter, when he wrote to the Optic newspaper, he said, I've been making my living gambling. And as you know, when he was captured, he had a pinking ring that had a mirror on it. And that was used for cheating at cards. So I do not think you can bring forward any evidence that he was rustling. He was making his living gambling in Fort Sumner, just like he said.
What brought you to this facet of history? What about your background brought you here? John?
So I was born in Roswell, and we would always take day trips to Riverboat, and I'd see Billy the Kid everywhere, so I kind of took him for granted. But most of my grandparents and great-grandparents were from Fort Sumner, so we would go there a lot for family reunions, and we'd always go and check out the grave. And back in those days, they had a museum in conjunction with the gravesite where they'd sell little cap guns and just cool stuff for little kids, and that always gave me good memories. And my grandma thought that I was naive, the one from Fort Sumner, and she tried to tell me that she had been Billy the Kid's sweetheart. And but even back then I did the math on that, and I just said, Grandma, you would have been way too old for Billy the Kid.
Well, she didn't have the market on that.
Yeah.
Ms. Sanchez, what brought you to Lincoln and Billy the Kid?
What brought me to it?
What brought you to Lincoln and to this facet of history?
Well, I've always loved history. I had parents like yours, they used to take you to all these neat places. And as a young person loving history, it was natural for me to study history. And then as I moved through my life, history was always part of it. And I mentioned to you before that I came here as a young widow. I was only I won't tell you how old I was, but I was very young. I was 14 and a half. I loved this area when my mother and I drove through towards Santa Fe, because I was looking for a place in Santa Fe. But when I saw Lincoln and the authenticity of the community and the beauty, the physical beauty of the land, and just the fact that there was so much history here and it looked old-timey and all of that, it appealed to my heart. And so I ended up here 52 years ago. And it's something that is just part of you. And if you love history, then you start asking questions. And then I started teaching, and I started finding out about the families who lived here at the time of Billy the Kid. And we became friends or colleagues at work. So it was just like a natural kind of fountain there.
Roy, you've authored so much on history, and you have a vast amount of knowledge about a lot of subjects outside of the Lincoln County and Billy the Kid. But what draws you to that specific facet?
Two things, primarily. growing up in the 1950s, when every other television show all day long was a Western. And I feel very fortunate to have grown up in the 50s when I could watch the stories of Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp and the other famous men. The other is genealogy. When my wife and I married in 1967, I was 14 then too. We were looking for a hobby that we could enjoy together, and we settled on genealogy and broadening on what I had heard about Wyatt Earp killing my ancestor Frank Stillwell. I started there, and then got into all the blood ancestors who were Texas Rangers. Stephen F. Austin appointed 6 men Texas Rangers in 1823, and one of my ancestors, John Tumlinson, was one of the 6, and the first Texas Ranger killed in the line of duty. So I began working at that early age, and then got busy with a family. And then the movie Tombstone came out. And my boys fell in love with the movie Tombstone. They can still recite the dialogue of that. And they learned about Frank Stillwell. And they said, Dad, how are we related to Frank Stillwell? Well, we share a common great-great-grandfather. And from there, I decided I need to get back into Wild West history. I joined the Western Outlaw Lawman Association that merged with NOLA, the National Outlaw Lawman Association, into the Wild West History Association back in 2008. I was selected as editor of that publication. I edited Wild West magazines for 16 years. And then when Kurt and I got into Billy the Kid, I just was fully immersed. I had been a minister in the Church of Christ for 50 years. I retired, and now my daily life is Wild West history.
Mr. Thomas, I think for those that don't know, you've got a wide array of scholarly interests and artistic interests outside of Billy the Kid. But what about Billy the Kid keeps drawing you back in?
Well, the reason I got interested in Billy the Kid because I was researching the history of Mesilla in southern New Mexico and the Civil War and the Mexican-American War. And of course, it's the Mexican-American War that gave all this territory to the United States. Well, the United States won it, of course. And I knew, of course, that Billy had been tried in Mesilla and the building was still there, but I didn't know much about it. I was able to find out when it was built, who they built it, how much they cost, and that research from Mesilla, which I did write a book about, led me into then researching Billy the Kid, and then that led into everything else. But about 20 years before that, I started researching World War II. So I've been to the National Archives many times, which is an incredible experience. Everybody should do it once in their life. I don't know if you know this or not, but in England, everything the government produces is owned by the government to this day. Well, when they did the revolution in this country, they didn't like that. So our Constitution says that our government cannot copyright anything. Any document, the only way they can protect a document is by classifying it. Any document the government produces is in the public domain. Pictures, movies, documents, resources, anything you want. So you can go to the National Archives and you can find the most amazing things. And you can take your computer, you can scan it, there's no cost. And everybody in their lifetime should at least once visit the National Archive. Of course, there's one in DC and one in Maryland Park.
Thank you.